Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. Today's episode is about history and we will talk about the Cold War. Now, before we start, let me remind you that you can find all the practice you need if you take the link I will leave in the description and go to our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. You will find interactive activities, a PDF practice worksheet you can download and practice, and then check your understanding through the answer sheet we provide as well. There's also our newest addition, and that is the interactive video, a video you can watch and it will pause automatically to ask you questions you need to answer before you continue, so to check your understanding while you're watching the video. And now, without further ado, let's start with our episode today about Cold War. People once thought the Cold War would never end. Sometimes they feared nuclear bombs would blow up the world. Now the Cold War has faded to a distant memory. The Cold War was a conflict primarily between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each power brought other countries into the conflict on its side. The Cold War lasted more than 40 years. From the mid-1940s to the end of the 1980s. Why was the war cold? Because the United States and the Soviet Union never got into armed combat, a shooting or hot war with each other. The Cold War began soon after World War II ended in 1945. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in defeating Nazi Germany in that war. The Soviet army had invaded Germany from the east. After the war, the Soviet Union kept control of countries in Eastern Europe that it had freed from German control. Those countries included Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. An iron curtain fell across Europe. That's how Winston Churchill, Britain's leader during World War II, described the division of Europe. There was no actual curtain, but there were strong barriers between Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and largely democratic Western Europe. The Soviet Union insisted on that. Barbed wire and armed soldiers at borders kept Eastern Europe separate from Western Europe during the Cold War. Defeated Germany was split into East Germany under Soviet control and West Germany. Berlin, Germany's former capital, was a divided city. In 1961, a concrete wall went up in Berlin along the dividing line. Broken glass on top of the Berlin Wall kept people from going over it and escaping to West Germany. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had different political and economic systems. The Soviet system was called communism. The United States and its allies feared that the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism to the rest of the world. They disliked the system. The goal of communism was to end private ownership of property. Under communism, the people would own everything communally. They would make decisions as a group. But things didn't work out that way in the Soviet Union. Instead, the country became a dictatorship under the control of the Communist Party. Many freedoms were lost. Millions of people who disagreed with the Communist Party were arrested and sent to prison camps. The United States and most of the countries of Western Europe had democratic governments rather than dictatorships. They valued freedoms that had been lost in the Soviet Union. Their economic system, capitalism, was based on private ownership and on individual rather than group effort. At times during the Cold War, the United States lost some freedoms because of fear of communism. During the 1950s, many Americans who were suspected of sympathy for communism lost their jobs. During the Cold War, each side built up its arsenal of weapons, especially nuclear weapons, atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. These weapons could destroy cities and kill hundreds of thousands of people. Each side was afraid the other would start a nuclear war first. A nuclear arms race began. Each side said it needed more weapons to retaliate in case of a nuclear attack. Both sides believed that if they had enough weapons, the other side wouldn't dare start a nuclear war. If it did, it would face total destruction in retaliation. The Soviet Union had put communist governments in power in Eastern Europe. Communist leaders had come to power in China. The Soviet Union and China backed groups that tried to take power in other countries. Wars broke out. The United States entered wars to stop the spread of communism. With the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the Cold War reached Asia. China backed North Korea, and the United States supported South Korea. Korea was still divided when fighting stopped in 1953, and it remains divided today. In 1962, the Cold War brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. The United States discovered that the Soviet Union had installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The missiles were pointed at the United States. War seemed certain, but the Soviet Union backed down and removed the missiles. The United States fought the spread of communism in the Vietnam War from 1959 to 1975. The U.S. government feared that if one Asian country fell to communism, the rest of Asia would become communist as well. The war ended with a communist victory in Vietnam, but communism did not spread throughout Asia. The Soviet Union nearly went broke as a result of the Cold War weapons race. The Soviet people had given up hope of a better life ahead. In the mid-1980s, a new leader came to power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was determined to improve life in his country. In the process, he helped bring the Cold War to an end. Gorbachev called for more freedom for his people. He and U.S. President Ronald Reagan agreed to destroy many of the weapons their countries had built. Gorbachev encouraged change in Eastern Europe, and he said that Soviet troops would no longer keep communist governments in power there. One after another, the countries of Eastern Europe got rid of their communist leaders. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Europe was no longer divided. Finally, parts of the Soviet Union declared their independence. The Cold War ended with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, that was our story about the Cold War. I hope you learned a thing or two about the Cold War, which you didn't know about before. But as usual, English Plus Podcast, what are we famous for? We're famous for teaching you a little bit more about words, right? So, we're going back to some of the words that we have here, and we will talk about them and tell you the meaning of these words. But again, before we start, let me remind you that you can practice everything: listening, comprehension, and the words we're going to learn about right now on our website. You can take the link I will leave in the description, and you will find everything you need there. Interactive activities, PDF practice worksheet you can download for free, of course, and check your understanding. And then, of course, you can check your answers with the answer key that is provided as well. And there's also our newest addition, and that is the interactive video. And that is a video that will pause automatically to ask you questions in the middle of the video. And you need to answer these questions just like checkpoints so that you make sure you understand everything before you finish. And this is just a way to make your experience a little bit more active. So, with that being said, let's start with our very first word, and that is conflict. Now, we said that each power brought other countries into the conflict on its side, when obviously we were talking about Cold War. What is the meaning of conflict? Conflict is a serious disagreement and argument about something important. If two people or groups are in conflict, they've had a serious disagreement or argument and have not reached agreement. And obviously that may lead to war. So that was conflict. And then we talked about allies and invaded, when we said the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in defeating Nazi Germany. So what is the meaning of allies? Now, a country's ally is another country that has an agreement to support it, especially in war. So that was the strange thing. They were allies in defeating Nazi Germany, but then they were adversaries. They were against each other in this Cold War that lasted about 40 years. And then we continued on and said the Soviet army had invaded Germany from the east. Now, what is the meaning of invade? To invade a country means to enter it by force with an army. And that's what the Soviet army did. it invaded Germany from the east. And of course, the Allies invaded Germany from the west as well. And by that, they defeated Nazi Germany. And then we continued on and talked about the Iron Curtain. And we said that's how Winston Churchill, Britain's leader during World War II, described the division of Europe. When we said the Iron Curtain, he called it the Iron Curtain. But what is the division? What is the word division? The division of a large unit into two or more distinct parts is the act of separating it into these parts. And that's exactly what happened to Europe. Europe was separated into two pieces, into two parts, East Europe and West Europe. So that was division. And then we said there was no actual curtain, of course. It was invisible, but it was there. But there were strong barriers between Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and largely democratic Western Europe. So what is the meaning of barrier? A barrier is something such as a rule, law, or policy that makes it difficult or impossible for something to happen or be achieved. Or it could be a problem that prevents two people or groups from agreeing, communicating, or working with each other. And there were a lot of barriers between Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And then we have another word that is very close to the meaning of division and barrier, and that is the word separate. When we said barbed wire and armed soldiers at borders kept Eastern Europe separate from Western Europe. Now here we say separate, not separate, because separate is the verb and separate is the adjective. Now if one thing is separate from another, there is a barrier or space or division between them so that they are clearly two things. And that is what happened with Eastern Europe and Western Europe. They were separate. But remember, if you want to use it as a verb, the same word, but we pronounce it differently. We say separate, not separate, separate. That is the verb. Separate is the adjective. And then we continued on and talked about communism. And obviously that was the system of the Soviet Union. Now, what is the meaning of communism? Although we talked about it in the text, but communism is the political belief that all people are equal and that workers should control the means of producing things. Now, it might be a beautiful idea to think about it this way, but in effect, it was never applied this way. And it was just another form of dictatorship. But anyway, this is not about politics. This is about listening and about history. So that was communism. Now, in communism, we said the people would own everything communally. Now, what is the meaning of communal? You use communal to describe something that is shared by a group of people. That is the meaning of communal. And then we talked about how things didn't work out that way in the Soviet Union, and instead the country became a dictatorship. What is the meaning of dictatorship? A dictatorship is a country which is ruled by a dictator or by a very strict and harsh government. So that was exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. It was a dictatorship. And now we talked about communism in the Soviet Union, but on the opposite side of the world, the main economic system was capitalism. Now, what is the meaning of capitalism? Capitalism is an economic and political system in which property, business, and industry are owned by private individuals and not by the state. It's just the opposite. And now it is obviously the predominant system in the world, and nobody can say that it is a perfect system. It has its flaws, and it allows for big gaps between the rich and the poor. But that is how humans are. We can never be perfect, right? Anyway, so that was the word capitalism. And then we talked about some freedoms that were lost even in the United States, and that especially during the 1950s. And we said that many Americans who were suspected of sympathy for communism lost their jobs. Now, what is the meaning of were suspected? What is the meaning to suspect? Now, you use suspect when you are stating something that you believe is probably true in order to make it sound less strong or direct. And obviously, we have here the word suspect. Again, here you can see that if we use a suspect as a noun, we say suspect. But if we use it as a verb, we say suspect. So it's just changing the stress. So here, a suspect is a person who the police or authorities think may be guilty of a crime. And here, some people were suspected of sympathy for communism, which was considered to be a crime back then. And because of that, they lost their jobs. There was this phenomenon that was called the Red Scare. People were scared of communism. And then we continued on and talked about the arsenal of weapons. We said during the Cold War, each side built up its arsenal of weapons. Now, what is the meaning of arsenal? Now, arsenal is, of course, the famous English club, but what does that mean? Arsenal, the word. An arsenal is a large collection of weapons and military equipment held by a country, group, or person. Now, that was the main problem of the Cold War. During the Cold War, each side built up its arsenal of weapons. They were ready, especially nuclear weapons. And that was a big problem because the world was at the brink of destruction because of this arms race. Anyway, we continued on and said that they were doing this because each side said it needed more weapons to retaliate in case of a nuclear attack. So that was the main excuse for the arms race. They wanted to have as much weaponry as possible to retaliate. What is the meaning of retaliate? If you retaliate when someone harms or annoys you, you do something which harms or annoys them in return. So it's like to take revenge. We're talking about revenge here, to retaliate. And then we continued on and talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we said that war seemed certain, but Soviet Union backed down and removed the missiles. So here, what is the meaning of back down? If you back down, you withdraw a claim, demand, or commitment that you made earlier because other people are strongly opposed to it. So that is the meaning of back down. And now for our very last word that we want to talk about, and that is collapse. And that is, of course, when we talked about the end of the Cold War. We said the Cold War ended with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. What is the meaning of collapse? If a building or other structure collapses, it falls down very suddenly. And we can use the same word to talk about systems as well, as in our case here when we talked about the collapse of communism. So that being said, that'll be all for this episode. I hope you learned a thing or two about the Cold War, and I hope you learned a couple of words that are interesting and that you can use in your own conversations based on what we talked about in this history episode about the Cold War. If you like the content we're creating and you would like to support us to create more content like that, you can become our patrons on Patreon. You will find a link in the description that will take you to our Patreon page. Support English Plus Podcast and become our patron and help us spread knowledge even further. With that being said, I would like to thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus Podcast. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.